My mother-in-law has always been manipulative, but this time it just feels different, and I don't know if we're overreacting. I tried really hard to be brief, but this issue is somewhat complex. First, some background info. My father-in-law died when dear husband, 29, was 19. Father-in-law has a daughter, sister-in-law, from a previous marriage. Sister-in-law and mother-in-law do not get along, but that's a totally different story. Mother-in-law is not fully aware that dear husband and I are close with sister-in-law and that we talk regularly. Sister-in-law is a licensed insurance agent. This is relevant later. Now that we have that out of the way, on to my manipulative mother-in-law and her latest scheme. About 2 months ago, dear husband, mother-in-law, aunt, and me all had lunch together, and mother-in-law handed dear husband some paperwork and told him she needed him to sign it right then and there. Dear husband had no idea what the paperwork was. He asked what it was, and mother-in-law gave some really vague answer, saying it had to do with his life insurance policy. She kept saying since she was paying for it, she needed him to sign the paperwork because it's only fair. Dear husband didn't feel comfortable signing it and told her he would read it later and give it back when he sees her in a few weeks. Mother-in-law played the "Don't you trust me? I'm your mother" card. But dear husband wouldn't budge, and with aunt there, she wasn't going to make a scene, and relented. The rest of lunch goes relatively well, and we leave with mother-in-law reminding dear husband to bring the signed paperwork when he sees her next. A few weeks go by, and we haven't had time to read the paperwork, so dear husband shows it to his therapist and asks his thoughts since he's pretty knowledgeable about financial and legal documents. Therapist tells dear husband to absolutely not sign anything until he talks to the insurance company, because something just doesn't seem right and he should get more information. Dear husband sees his mom later that same night and tells her he forgot the paperwork so he can stall while he figures it out. Dear husband and I weren't really sure what to do next, so we called sister-in-law to get some clarity. So she helps us get into the account, and it turns out father-in-law and mother-in-law took out a modest but generous policy on dear husband when he was a child. The policy has cash assets available. The way it was set up is so that dear husband is the owner of the policy and full control of the account transferred to him when he turns 21. Now, when sister-in-law was a child, father-in-law and her mother did the same thing for her. And once she turned 21, father-in-law gave her all the policy information and told her she could either pay the monthly premium or withdraw the cash assets and cancel the policy. As far as we can tell, the only difference now is father-in-law passed before dear husband turned 21, and thus the account was hidden from dear husband until now. Side note, when dear husband was 26, he had to go on medical leave from school. As a result, we wound up in a desperate financial bind, and dear husband had to ask mother-in-law for money so we wouldn't be homeless. She gave him a loan, with interest, through a bank. Edit, it is a personal loan from her account to his. A bank was used to make the loan agreement. He is currently paying the loan off. When she gave him the loan, she knew he had cash assets available in this policy and still never told him about it. We are fairly confident she is trying to coerce dear husband into signing ownership of the policy to her so that she can take out the cash assets for herself. Dear husband is not going to sign it and wants to keep the policy and continue paying the very affordable monthly premium, especially since he could never get a policy for such a low payment if he were to get a new one right now. Had he known of the policy, he would have taken over payments himself years ago. So to us, mother-in-law arguing it is only fair for her to have ownership doesn't really hold any water. We see her tomorrow. She wants the signed paperwork, and I have absolutely no idea what is going to happen when dear husband refuses. And I guess I just need to know, are we being reasonable? Is this as bad and wrong as it really feels, or does mother-in-law have a point? Edit. I didn't mean to imply a stay-at-home mom doesn't contribute to a family. Dear husband's mom absolutely did contribute to the policy when he was a child, and certainly helped financially in other ways. She was an equal in her marriage regardless of her employment. When I said she didn't technically pay into the policy, I mean it to point out her implication that father-in-law's wishes don't matter when he contributed to it too, and helped set it up for dear husband when he was a child. When mother-in-law came to our house, she asked dear husband if he had the paperwork. Dear husband asks her once again to explain what is going on, and she begins by saying she has been paying for the policy for 23 years, and that is why she needs the signed paperwork. The policy should be hers. Dear husband asks her why she never told him about it 10 years ago, and brings up sister-in-law's policy from father-in-law and asks why, how this is different. She was absolutely blindsided and clearly not expecting us to have this information. It's important to note that this woman thinks we and everyone else are stupid. It apparently never occurred to her we would dig into the details of the policy and do our research. She was stunned. She actually muttered the words aloud, "But I need that money. I've been paying it for 23 years." Dear husband asks how she can say that when she never told him about the policy in the first place and took his choice away to pay for it by hiding it. He also reiterates father-in-law and her both contributed to the policy over his lifetime. Mother-in-law claims she was doing dear husband a favor by keeping the policy alive and insists that he was in no financial position to pay for the policy anyways. This is false. Dear husband could absolutely afford less than $30 a month, and at the very least, I could have afforded it. She also tries to insist the loan she gave him was 10 years ago instead of 4 years ago. She made this claim multiple times, and as soon as we provided evidence that it was in fact 4 years ago, she denied ever saying she gave him the loan 10 years ago. She made both statements within 60 seconds. It was bizarre. Dear husband was doing most of the talking, but the first time I chimed in, mother-in-law told me she was trying to have a conversation between mother and son and that it didn't concern me. Dear husband immediately shut her down, reminding her that while dear husband and I aren't legally married, we have been a couple for 13 years and she can't dismiss me. We are a team, and what concerns him absolutely concerns me. Mother-in-law changes her story and says the policy was always supposed to be in her name and the insurance agent made a mistake when they started the policy. She claims the money was supposed to be for her retirement and she only realized recently that the policy wasn't in her name. There are a few problems with her explanation. The cash assets in the account are not enough to be a retirement fund, like not even close. It would last the average person a few months. The policy bills were being sent to her address, but were addressed to dear husband because he is the owner of the policy for 23 years. Mother-in-law is meticulous about her money and all her finances. There is just zero chance she didn't catch this error if she was always supposed to be the policy owner. Again, for 23 years. She's so anal about money, she once gave dear husband an itemized and dated list of all the things she's paid for him, like stuff she randomly gives him that he never asks for. Since he turned 18, she literally just said she was paying the premium to keep it alive for him because she was convinced he couldn't afford it. I know I didn't just imagine her saying she thought she was doing him a favor. Dear husband isn't buying any of it because it doesn't make sense. He absolutely stuns her by explaining the type of account it is and why what she's saying doesn't really add up. He brings up that it is impossible for him to get a policy at the rate this one is at, especially with all of his mental health diagnosis and other health problems. Plus, with how concerned she is about the dangers of his job, he would think she'd want him to be protected. He added this because mother-in-law doesn't know she isn't going to be the beneficiary. He asks again about sister-in-law, why mother-in-law never told him about the existence of the policy, and how she can hold the payments she's made against him when he never had the chance to take them over. She sat there looking at her lap. We were silent for like 3 minutes while she tried not to cry. When she finally spoke up, she said her CPA thinks the account isn't set up in a good way and that it is losing money and that she needed to cash out the policy to reinvest it. Based on the numbers she told us she had from June, the account has actually grown. Honestly, she could be right here in the long term. We haven't had time to speak to a professional or have the knowledge to understand how it's invested. We told her the account hasn't lost money. Her numbers did not reflect the current state of the account. And it didn't really matter anyways, since dear husband is taking over the payments and decisions from now on. She threw out a last-ditch effort that was deflected by dear husband, and then she dropped it at that point. I don't think she's accepted yet that she isn't getting her way, and I really don't think this is the end of this. But she obviously realized we weren't going to budge. I'm pretty sure she's still convincing herself we will. For now, dear husband and I are going to speak to the insurance company and possibly mother-in-law's CPA. However, we are planning to look into our own CPA if we can budget for it. This story takes place a few years ago. At the time, I'd been married to my husband for around 10 years. My father-in-law, who was an all-around cool guy, had suffered a catastrophic stroke in the early 90s and was plagued by many medical issues as a result of the same. They finally caught up to him, and dear husband and I went back to his hometown for the funeral and to help his mother. Side note, dear husband's hometown is a very small town south of the Mason-Dixon line. I was born and raised well north of said line. I am in many ways a complete outsider in dear husband's hometown, an urban Yankee in a southern small town. a lapsed Irish Catholic turned Wiccan among Baptists, a techie person among farm folk. And I think I made them nervous despite standing barely over 5 feet and having the physical prowess of an asthmatic kitten. My in-laws and I have a great mutual respect for one another's beliefs and way of life, though, so the rest of them can push off. When dear husband left his hometown to move out west with me, he was groomed to small southern town standards, with his hair trimmed off his collar. He and I have been engaged in a sort of hair-based staring match for the entirety of our marriage, and neither of us has blinked yet. He's 6 feet plus, and his hair falls past his belt. This is absolutely relevant, I promise. At father-in-law's wake, my mother-in-law was accompanied by either dear husband or myself at all times for emotional support. And because frankly, this was a small town, and people hold grudges for so long that they become family heirlooms, passed down with loving care from generation to generation. Dear husband's paternal great-grandfather had been a very nice man, so of course there were people who took advantage of him, got kicked in the ass by karma, and decided to be petty about it and hand that pettiness down to their descendants. Similarly, father-in-law had been a very nice man, and thus was the tradition played out again to stock up a few more grudges held by petty a-holes. Dear husband and I were absolutely determined that 0 petty a-holes were going to get within emotional spitting distance of his mother. This sweet lady had spent like 20 years taking care of her greatly loved husband, and damned if we were going to let anyone upset her further for any reason. Dear husband, being more familiar with the potential problem children, acted as a spotter and subtly pointed out people who needed to be deflected. I would either move in and tell them in the crowd, cutting them out and hurting them as necessary, or stand my ground beside mother-in-law and stare at them, unblinking, occasionally deploying my strabismus superpower when they came up to speak to her, depending on whether I was free roamer or on station. It was working out pretty well. Because y'all seemed to like the fashion report, I was wearing a long-sleeved black cotton turtleneck shirt over black slacks, a brass pentacle necklace, and had my hair bundled up in a clip. I guess the overall impression was some kind of possibly devil-worshipping murderer, judging by the way some of the problem people reacted to me. I don't know why, honest. I mean, I was even smiling at them, with the smile that dear husband has compared to a shark's, all teeth and dead eyes staring out under my eyebrows, Kubrick style. I was on station at mother-in-law's side when dear husband caught my eye and marked someone out of the crowd. I would learn later that this is the mother-in-law of one of dear husband's cousins. The cousin was fine, her husband was fine, but the cousin's mother-in-law, well, she barely knew father-in-law personally, but she was dressed like the chief mourner at a Vatican funeral, complete with so much shiny jewelry that entire flocks of magpies were probably lurking outside, waiting to pick her clean. What I saw on her face at the first glance was the perpetual faint smirk of the emotional predator, sensing weakness and moving in. Oh, my dear sainted mother-in-law's name, this must be so terrible for you. Father-in-law was such a wonderful, brave man, and you were such a wonderful, godly wife, supporting him all this time. Whatever will you do with yourself now that he's gone? B. Her husband just died like 3 days ago. Back off. Well, I just don't know yet, my mother-in-law said, starting to tear up again. My chin inclined by an inch, and the corners of my mouth rode up slightly. Whatever she does, she's got a great support network of family and friends. Cousin's mother-in-law. That's good. She stared at me for a moment while I stared back and failed to blink, then said, And who are you, honey? Sainted mother-in-law. Oh, this is my wife's son, O.P. Cousin's mother-in-law. Your son? Name. Oh, isn't that him over there? I didn't recognize him with that hair he's got. Mind you, my husband's hair is very neatly kept. From the front, you can't even tell it's as long as it is if he's got it pulled back in a braid or a ponytail. And it was braided on this occasion. He dresses very nicely by habit and looked entirely respectable. Me, a crescent moon of teeth showing as my lips curled back. Isn't it fantastic? Cousin's mother-in-law. Well, I can't believe he didn't get a haircut even for his own father's funeral. I'd think he had more respect for me, seeing that my sainted mother-in-law is clouding over again. His parents raised a man who was confident enough to stand by his own life decisions. Besides, of the two of us, he's the short-haired one. Cousin's mother-in-law. He what? I turned my back, reached up, and took out the hair clip. And the rope of my straight, fine hair slid loose, unwinded as it fell past my shoulders, and down my back, and below my belt, and finished spinning out at knee level. It was like a ducking party trick. Yeah, this stunt probably makes me sound like a narcissistic attention W. I was doing this right next to the casket, for duck's sake. But I wanted attention off of my mother-in-law so she could compose herself again. I have social anxieties that stack up to the ceiling, and short of falling on an actual physical grenade, drawing attention to myself was the biggest sacrifice I could make in the moment. I have gradually built up a good thick shield of ductlessness that comes out when I recognize the need for confrontation. But at the time of this story, it wasn't fully developed. Mission ducking accomplished. Cousin gasped in delight. Cousin's mother-in-law stared in surprise, and I whipped a couple of tissues out of my pocket for my sainted mother-in-law, who quickly regained her poise. Of course, now the hair was out of the clip. And the next hour or so was an uncomfortable level of continuing scrutiny for me. Even positive attention is difficult for a socially anxious person to handle in large quantities. Later that night, after the viewing was over and we got back to my in-laws' house, my mother-in-law stopped us just as we get into the kitchen and hugged the crap out of us. Sainted mother-in-law, I don't know what y'all were doing tonight. Thank you. I don't know if I'd made it through in one piece if y'all hadn't been there. She paused, and then she got this downright impish smile. And I loved seeing that look on Cousin's mother-in-law's face when you took your hair down, OP. I know she was angling to make me cry, and you certainly got her to pipe down. It's nice to be appreciated, isn't it?